210.
Hi there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to yet another cracking installment of the Matt Brown Show. This is the Built in New York series, where I'm connecting you to some incredible founders, visionaries, and just people changing the world for the better. So with me today and with us today is none other than Arthur Mathison, the founder and CEO of Mathison.io. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Great to be here.
Mate, I've been looking forward to this for some reason. I've been thinking about you, dude. I don't know. Maybe it's like something about like first impressions.
Best,
I know, right? I just can't stop. Make it stop.
I get that a lot, Matt. No,
you
I'm
do?
sure you get that a lot. I'm sure.
No,
people are thinking of you. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what else would they be doing? I mean, come on.
That's right.
Yeah,
you're an impressionable guy, Matt. You know.
Yeah. Well, likewise. You know, we're both wearing black today, so that's.
I know. I saw that. We got the memo. You know, Black Friday.
I know, right? Exactly. Yeah. Just everything's just working
just a month
out
early.
So well.
You know.
Oh no, exactly. Cool, buddy. Well, look, I've had the privilege of kind of getting to know you and learning more around like your background and kind of like the amazing company that you built. But for our viewers around the world who haven't had my access to you, why don't you give us a bit about the origin story? Kick us off. Where do we begin?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Well, and your story is super inspiring too. So I appreciate you sharing it when we connected. So I mean, I grew up in a rural town in Northern California, single parent family, very conservative. I came out in the LGBTQ community halfway through college. And I think like a lot of folks that sort of resorted to entrepreneurship, part of the drive for me was that I didn't feel like I fit in. In many cases, I didn't feel like I was following the corporate, sort of herd to conventional jobs. And I sort of realized that entrepreneurs kind of beat to their own drum. And so, in college, I had a chance to start my first company. And one of the things that really quickly emerged was that, wow, there are a lot of students with their own ideas for companies, and they're not usually given the space and the support to launch their companies. And what better time to do that than as a student when you have 4 years, to learn and to experiment. And so I ended up getting into entrepreneurial like incubation. And when I left college, entered my first corporate job, which was at Google, I sort of discovered the path of entrepreneurship and the fact that you can innovate even in the context of a larger company. But I became really fascinated with the future of work, realizing partly that, we spend the majority of our waking lives at work. Work is broken for most people. Work is not usually a place where people feel a great sense of belonging, of thriving. And so I ended up getting really into building software to make work better, both helping people learn, helping organizations build more inclusive cultures, now focused really on diversity. And so I've been, for the last 15 years or so, really kind of at the helm of HR technology.
Well, it's a very interesting space because, I just gave the report to my wife this morning, but I was at a Vistage meeting earlier this week, and there seems to be like this massive problem for, not only startups, but the C-suites and companies trying to solve this problem of like, talent scarcity, quote unquote. And it seems to me like, well, I know for a fact in the US, not like this in Africa at all, but certainly in America, there are way more jobs available than there are people.
Yes.
Falling short of like a major recession and massive layoffs, like it's, that problem's not going to go away. So I remember when I was talking to, I think it was Ivan Misner or another like startup founder in Texas. And he was saying to me like, dude, like if someone comes for an interview, like they interviewing you more than you interviewing them as the potential hirer, because they have another 10 options, right? So he's like, dude, like trying to find people is a real headache for a lot of founders. So it's great and we need to like really get into this, because I think HR tech is a great enabler of an environment that is conducive not only to attract talent, but also to retain it too. Mathison.io, what's the problem that you guys solve from your perspective?
Yeah, well, and by the way, just picking up on what you just said, we're in an interesting time, to your point, that We have the kind of looming fears of this economic downturn, which we already know are hitting parts of the world. But we are also in a ridiculously competitive labor market, especially for senior roles. And so it's a bizarre time that employers are navigating. It's kind of uncharted territory, as if it hadn't been uncharted for the last 2 years with the pandemic. But what we found at Mathison, Matt, was that there is a huge challenge in terms of companies really making progress on diversity and inclusion, because in part they don't have the metrics to even gauge how much progress they're making. Most companies are basically driving blind around the state of their diversity, the state of their policies, how equitable and unbiased they are. And even where they need to focus what is becoming increasingly very limited and scarce capacity. And our belief, that you can't manage what you can't measure, directly results in most organizations not making a lot of progress. So in the last 2 years, while so many companies and so many leaders said, well, we really have all these ambitious goals, many now 2 years later have not really seen much traction at all. In some cases, they've gone backwards in their progress. So we built an analytics system that helps companies basically measure the state of diversity, different dimensions of diversity, how equitable and accessible their policies and practices are, and even the sentiment of their team members. And the goal with this is to give companies very clear direction on where they need to focus their attention. And then we've equipped companies with tools around things like writing inclusive job descriptions, diversity sourcing, and training. And the thought is that instead of having this very decentralized set of resources, let's bring all of these resources together in one place for companies, so that they can have one platform that enables them to really make progress. And we work with organizations across the spectrum, from very early stage, high growth, all the way to kind of big enterprises, realizing that most employers that care about this want to have a system to really kind of act on.
Mm-hmm. And so I want to kind of bring your background into this, because something you said to me when I first met you was, you were like, even at these big companies like Google, who are supposed to be like cutting edge technology companies, like inside, you still felt, your sense was that the workplace, environment is quote broken. And it is a thing, right? Like I think it's almost, especially in startups, it's the last thing you think about. Like, what's my talent strategy? Like, you're thinking about like product and engineering and funding, and then more product and more engineering, and and then slowly you start, and then once you hit like 25, 50 people, then suddenly talent strategy becomes a strategic enabler and a conversation that happens more frequently. And then the problem becomes, well, I have no idea how to do it. It's a huge thing. Like, I'm a founder, like I don't know anything about talent strategy, right? So, and I'm not thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not thinking about that. And my sense is, and this is where I want to go with you, Arthur, is my sense is a lot of companies, not just startups, but even big companies, at scale, are not thinking about DEI as a strategic enabler of their business. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I 100%, Matt. And this, from also all of your work internationally. I mean, I think a lot of organizations today continue to see the DEI work as something that is nice to have, that they need to signal because everyone else is doing it, and it's largely performative. And if we sort of flip the equation and start to help folks realize it's strategic, if you have a diverse team, diversity of thought, that's actually what enables you to innovate. If you create an inclusive, psychologically safe culture, that's what keeps people and enables them to thrive and do their best work at work. And if you're equipping leaders to kind of think about the way that they're empowering and supporting their teams in a whole new way, that's honestly what's going to enable the best performance from your organization. So we're in this interesting mode where a lot of folks are kind of in one of two camps. They either look at it in a very performative sort of icing on the cake way, or they see it as strategic. And our belief, and I know this is part of why your podcast is amazing, we believe that if we can start to reach leaders earlier on in their journeys to think about this important body of work, it's so much easier to embed DEI in the beginning of an organization's inception than it is to reverse engineer it, when you're a large corporation that has a lot of built-in kind of cemented systems. So I personally love anytime we can sit down with founders and help them think about, okay, how do I, when I'm growing my organization, I'm still a very, very small team. What are the ways that I institute these ideas early on? And most founders are more susceptible, or, they're more receptive to it, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so you literally wrote the book of this, which you didn't actually tell me. I had to find out secretly. But on your website. So
you're good with your research, Matt. I like it.
Dude,
yeah,
I know, right? I do my research while I'm doing the interview. But you wrote the book called Hiring for Diversity, The Guide to Building an Inclusive and Equitable Organization. I want to double click on something, because I think when we talk about, diversity, it seems to me that like organizations have quite a limited definition of what they mean by diversity. Like from South Africa, where I'm from, there's 11 official languages. So obviously diversity is, it's not just about the languages. You know what I mean? Like there's a broader definition of what it means to be inclusive or equitable or diversity. Like these things mean different things to different people. They're almost like happy, sad. It's like, well, they mean different. Or success. Success is a good one, right? Success to you means something very different to what success means to me and everybody else listening to us and watching us right now. So, so what is the definition here when we say that we're hiring for diversity? What is the prevailing definition from your perspective that future fit organizations should be working with when we say the word diversity?
Yeah. Well, the best way to think about it is if we look at the many different dimensions of communities that exist in society, and to your point, this is not simply just looking at languages or looking at race or looking at gender. It's really looking at all the different facets of how someone identifies, right? Or how someone sort of finds their sense of community. There are many more dimensions than we typically speak about in like a corporate setting. So part of our whole, motion with the book was to talk about, 13 different dimensions of diversity, not only the neurodivergent community, the disability community, people who were formerly incarcerated, but to think about all of the different dimensions, even that make up the LGBTQ community, which are very multifaceted now. And so in writing about these different communities, the goal was to help individuals see that diversity is intersectional. An individual can identify in multiple communities. Diversity is not necessarily just visible. A lot of recruiters today, as you know, go to LinkedIn and look at someone's photo and basically assume their communities with very limited data. In reality, a person could identify in a given community and we have no clue in some cases, right? So we always kind of talk about that iceberg, metaphor, right? That many different dimensions of diversity are below the water. And if we think about the kind of the ultimate goal of the work is that we have ideally organizations that represent the diversity that exists in society. And today, not only are most organizations not even accounting for diversity, but they're, especially as they go more and more senior in their organizations, they're not seeing much diversity at all. It's quite homogenous. So we have that kind of goal of, our organizations represent diversity that we see in society.
Mm-hmm. And so from your perspective, is if you hire for diversity as an example, like, do you feel like that is a strategic enabler of growth or not?
100%. 100%. I mean, I think if we really kind of look long term at what diversity enables for us, I think about Airbnb. For many years, Airbnb was focused on building an inclusive culture, but realized that in many cases there were large populations that weren't well represented. And what they found was that was directly leading to their limitation in terms of reaching new markets, because their customer base really represented their team. No surprise, that was their marketing, that was their product strategy. And as they started to build a more diverse and equitable team internally, they realized, wow, we're opening up entirely new market segments where we have an understanding of how to reach these customers. And it shifted, for example, how they could reach the Hispanic and Latinx community. And so I think as we think about kind of the implication, the business case behind diversity, it's that we believe that a team that we build internally represents the customers we can serve externally. And I think diversity of thought is what enables us to innovate, right? If we have a homogenous team and everyone is coming in with the same ideas, we're not really thinking outside the box as well as we could be, right?
Yeah, and yeah, I mean I love that point because great ideas can come from anywhere. A, B, and what I love about like Airbnb's positioning or category idea, it's like belong anywhere. And they've been able to scale and access all these different subsegments, if you like, of culture that ultimately has allowed them to become the behemoth that they are. And I think also like it's interesting. I would say that probably let's just say I interviewed 10 founders, I would probably say that about 60% are not from the US, which is interesting, right? And they're creating value in the US. And the whole idea of like the American dream is built on this idea of inclusion, diversity, and equity, right? Like that is the foundation of the American dream. Obviously there's other things to it, but in the context of this conversation, that's where I would say it's like it's the living embodiment of like what it means to be an immigrant such as Matt Brown in America. You know what I mean? Like it is built on these principles, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. Well, in your story, I mean, I imagine there's no coincidence that these great entrepreneurs that you're meeting from outside of the States have a similar story to you, which is growing successful companies in their home countries and then finding themselves here, perhaps, right? But I think you're absolutely right that our personal stories and our kind of lived identities have so much to do with the unique way that we lead. And I like your story so much because it's a superpower, right? Like your unique lived experience, building, being among the few super successful, companies coming out of South Africa, for example, are a huge part of how you are, building awareness and helping others see what's possible, and I love that. And that's kind of what's unique about the DEI work in general is that unlike any other body of work, it's so inextricably linked to our identities, right? Every single person has a different experience and sort of psychological relationship to the work because of their lived experience and lived identities.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely right. So let's talk about your product here. And so like we've now tabled, like this is an important thing. So it enables growth, it matters, innovation, and all this kind of stuff. So, so walk us through like what you've actually built. Like how does your product, solve this DEI problem for a business? Where does it start?
Yeah. So basically, to start out, most organizations, when they're working with Mathison, end up realizing that they're having trouble even just with the fundamental, like, where do we start? Where are our gaps? Where are our greatest needs? Where do we focus our limited attention? And it's a fairly fundamental question if you think about it. It's like that we all have these big goals, grandiose goals for where the work goes, but a lot of folks are just struggling with like what are the like very kind of basic stepping stones, right? So the platform enables companies to diagnose all of their policies and practices to figure out where they have bias, where they have gaps. It enables them to get a very holistic read on these different dimensions of diversity, and enables them to survey their people from a team sentiment standpoint. And combining all this data into one view gives organizations a pretty clear idea of where do we need to focus our most urgent goals for the quarter. And rather than make it a one-time only measurement exercise, the system is set up to be a quarterly dashboard that gives them basically a prioritized roadmap. And when connecting organizations to these goals, the whole hope is that we actually connect them to resources to go and achieve the goals. So we've curated content, tools, resources to basically execute on the goals that we've set. And so the hope is that, over years, organizations are making tremendous progress. It's a continuous effort. It's not just a one-time only exercise. And they can go back and report to their stakeholders, their board, their leadership team, their broader organization, all of the progress they've made.
Mm-hmm. So I've got your website up for everyone. Please explain what the Mathison Equity Index Assessment is. What is that?
Yep. So the equity index is that policy, basically analytics system that's helping you gauge how inclusive, basically equitable and unbiased are our policies and practices, because employers basically have had to navigate a lot of different, basically policy and procedural changes. And many of them don't know sort of where they need to focus or where their gaps are. So we created this really comprehensive assessment system that walks through every stage of the employer's hiring process, every stage of their onboarding, advancement, talent retention practices, and gives them basically a readout on where they are excelling, where they have pressing gaps, and where they need to focus. And oftentimes we find that employers, sort of previously would have had to hire a consultant to do that kind of analysis. It would have been very manual, very expensive, and kind of one time only. So this process of actually having an analytic system that gives you this measurement enables you to basically kind of access this type of analysis at scale.
Mm-hmm. So I actually asked you when we first met, like, how does this DEI metrics conversation actually play out in the real world? And you gave me an interesting breakdown around DEI. Like, D is a representation of communities. E is obviously the equity index, as percentage, and then I is about safety, belonging, and inclusion. I'm curious to unpack this, because if you're not, breathing this space every single day, and you're coming in at like relatively cold, like these things, they're either not thought about, or they're not. It's like this one. In other words, what I'm trying to get to is like, it's measurable, yes, but then it's like, well, what do you do with it? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, for
absolutely.
Like, if your D is, I don't know what the metric is, but let's just say it's like 20% or whatever it is, or maybe it's a red. Like, what do you do with it? So on top of measuring your performance within the DEI context, do you guys, and I'm assuming you do, but do you guys make recommendations strategically to your customers or to businesses on how to improve those metrics?
Yes, 100%. So, and I, the breakdown, which you said beautifully, but, if we think about diversity as these different dimensions of representation, equity is how accessible and equitable and unbiased our systems are. And then inclusion really being the, sort of do our team members feel a sense of belonging and safety, and are they included literally through the lens of their sentiment, right? The idea behind getting this really comprehensive set of measurements and making it continuous is that employers have a really kind of interesting action plan to know where are our most critical issues. For some, they might find that they have a great representation, but their team does not feel included, and therefore they need to be thinking about changes they're making to their culture, to their team development. There might be real gaps in policies and practices, which mean even though you're doing well in terms of representation, you're not really creating a level playing field for every community. And that really is a change to governance and internal policies that needs to be made, maybe at the leadership level. And so, the goal in all of this work is to help organizations navigate a pretty complex state of affairs and synthesize very clear actions in fairly short order. In a way, previously, honestly, Matt, that's been quite manual to date, so kind of demystifying all of this. What I find super interesting is when you start to have benchmarking data. So, now that hundreds of organizations have taken all of this, we start to be able to understand, well, for an organization like you at this stage of development, in this region or in this industry even, here are what, other groups are doing. And I think that kind of social benchmarking is honestly part of what changes behavior for employers, right? When you start to see, wow, that there is possibility for a group just like you in terms of what you're not doing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've just got some of your customer stories up for everyone, Cornerstone being one of them. How quickly can you start getting value out of something like this? Do you know what I mean? Like, if you can't even find relevant talent as fast as you would like, and as we touched on up front, this idea of talent scarcity is a thing. I know that's a small piece of a very big conversation here. Maybe this is a conversation that's, not only the hiring, but actually like your existing workforce dynamics and things like that. Like, if a customer engages with you, like, I'm a CEO also, so I'm curious to know, like, how fast is my time to value here? Is this something that's a 6-month story or a 1-year story? Like, how fast are you creating value for customers?
Yeah, part of where I think there's been some real innovation here is the time to value is actually quite short. So an organization can onboard to the platform, complete that equity index in under an hour to get an initial read on their gaps. And that exercise previously would have been, okay, you hire a consultant, they come in, they do focus groups, months and months or weeks pass, and then they maybe deliver an initial deck of resources. So to be able to onboard to a platform, answer a series of questions and already have an initial analysis in under an hour is fairly, it's fairly speedy. What's interesting is, as you know, as you start to add in more data, you start to be able to layer in team surveying and representation data, and it gives you a more and more complete picture. So the idea is to limit, to minimize that time to value, but also incentivize an employer to put in more and more information. And to make it so that, in a quarter, they're coming back to the system. They're not simply just looking at this as a one-time exercise like they have in many cases. But I'm really proud of the team that sort of minimized time to value is part of the innovation. And as you know, everyone has the best of intent in terms of making progress, but the reality of, if I have limited time, limited resources, in many cases, I'm not going to be making progress or putting a lot of energy into this if it's too much of a lift. So we've really tried to kind of lower that barrier to engagement.
So I want to talk about some founder stories for our other entrepreneurs out there, and there's a few things here I wanted to kind of get into. So the first thing is, like, you could have stayed at Google, right? And like, not a bad place to work. Arguing, like, if you said to me, "Hey, where do you do?" And I work at Google. I'm like, "That's a cool gig," because you work at Google. So you could have decided to stay there, but you didn't. Why? What was that reason?
Well, Matt, I mean, I'll tell you that, like, a week or a month doesn't go by in my entrepreneurial journey where I sometimes don't ask myself, why not stay in a corporate environment? I'll be honest that I think the thrill of building something, of bringing ideas to life, and of having autonomy in a professional path was so incredibly inspiring and motivating. And I think as entrepreneurs, I mean, like, everyone who's gone the path of an entrepreneur, and I know you have, of course, an amazing track record. We think about kind of the risk profile of the entrepreneurial journey, and yes, sometimes not having a promised set of resources or not having a lot of security, but having that autonomy is incredible. So for me, it was really about kind of being inspired by that thrill and exhilaration of bringing an idea to life, of working with really interesting people, because as an entrepreneur, I think you can. You have a lot of leeway around who you bring into your orbit, right? Sometimes for better or for worse. And also, I think, like, the ability for engaging in something that you really feel like is making the world better. That for me has been a major driver in most of what I've been able to do, is kind of to feel like I'm somehow creating value where there wasn't any.
Yeah. Tell me, how much money have you raised to date?
Yeah, so across the companies I've started, at this point, probably somewhere around 40 million.
Okay. So with Mathison, didn't you raise funding during COVID or the beginning stages of the pandemic?
We did. Yeah, it was a very interesting time. We had started in 2019, May 2019, and then 6 months in, COVID hit. And it was, I'll tell you, it was a very scary moment. And we thought maybe this is kind of the end of the DEI work. And a few months later, after that, as many remember, was the murder of George Floyd. And it felt as though the world just changed overnight. And all of the sort of DEI work that many thought was elective was now essential. And we were kind of right in the middle of that. So we saw 2 years of pretty extraordinary growth that I would kind of attribute to that big shift in the world.
Right. So there's a lot of conversation now with the market being where it is, hyperinflation, macroeconomics. A lot of VCs are, like, I think the latest number I saw was that it's like a 30% drop year on year in terms of venture capital entering into startups. Excuse me, or the startup ecosystem. A lot of talk about cost of capital being higher, a lot of talk about, investors being more selective, a lot of talk about investors, who typically would do Series B, C, D, moving earlier on in the cycle. So it seems to me like the struggle of raising money, which every startup founder I talk to is like always in some kind of raise, and if they're not, they're going to be in this quarter. If they're not in one, like they'll be in one in the next quarter. You have raised a significant amount of capital, and during one could say probably one of the hardest periods to raise money, probably even harder now, because there's a lot, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, there was even more uncertainty than even now, even though it sucks now and we're dealing with the ongoing ramifications of the pandemic. What's your advice to a startup founder in the current market looking to head into a raise about raising capital?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Well, I mean, I think in the last 2 years we've seen a lot of complacency around raises in general. That both in terms of just the appetite of investors. We've seen a lot of not super conservative valuations. The sort of inflated, sometimes balloon valuations, some of which have been reflecting projections a year or two out and not like the present day metrics. I think that's all somewhat been normalized by the new kind of economic conditions. I think the first thing, the first advice I give to founders is raise really around goals that you intend to hit, right? I think a lot of founders get in this motion of, I need to raise around for the sake of raising around, versus really asking, what is the capital that I need? What are my goals? And what's the capital that I need to achieve those goals? And in some cases, founders are realizing they can bootstrap. They can look to alternate, sources of capital. They can manage to get creative with some of their growth right now, maybe in a way that didn't have to involve that default fundraising strategy that everyone sort of said you had to take. So I think getting really kind of clear on like what are your goals and where does investment fit? I would say getting really clear on also just sort of the types of capital partners that you really want right now. There are a lot of investors that are swooping in and kind of opportunistically investing. In many cases, with entrepreneurs feeling like they're kind of backed against the wall, and they're not given as much optionality as they had like a year ago, right? So I think still setting a high bar in terms of values alignment and ensuring that the folks that you're choosing are going to be really good long-term strategic partners for you, even though it might feel like you have fewer options to choose from right now.
Yeah, it's an interesting period. There was a YouTube video I was watching. I forget the guy's. I think his name's like Kashish or something. He's an Indian venture capitalist. It was basically, even though he's made a shit ton of money, like being a VC, he was basically saying, like, if you raise, let's just say $10 million, for instance, Series A, or for argument's sake, he's like 40% of that goes to Google, Facebook, and Amazon on average. Because it's like, well, why do you need the money? Well, you need it to grow. Well, how do you grow? You advertise. Where do you advertise? Well, it's Facebook, Google, and Amazon.
Yes. Yep.
It's
true. Wow. It's sobering. It's a sobering realization, right?
But isn't it ridiculous, right? You would think, well, who's benefiting from this? Like, and then the other thing is, like, in the portfolio of a VC, let's just say they have 10 startups. It's usually more than that, but let's just say it's 10. Like, they're also managing a fund. So like they're getting 2%, 3% of like, of a $500 million fund. They're making, 10 million a year or whatever, just to manage the fund. And then there's like the upside, should one of the startups they've invested in like get some kind of exit at a valuation that's, I don't know, at a 10x multiple, for instance. And it seems to me, like, to your point, there's the issue that I'm seeing is that there was the way of doing things before, and to your point, it's like no money is the same. Like if I raise, like if I raise 10 bar from this investor and another 10 bar from this consortium, let's just say, I don't know, like whoever it is, like it's not the same. Like I'm getting the same amount of money, but it's what else?
Absolutely. And not all we know that not all capital is good capital, and certainly capital is not free. I think a lot of founders, sort of believe that they win the lottery when they're raising a round. It's like you've made a promise and you've given away a huge portion of your company for that round. So And that's, I think, to your point, why it's even more critical right now that entrepreneurs, even though it feels like there's a bit of a scarcity mindset, which is what any, I think, economic downturn instills for some, that we're really, still savvy and clear about what we want to achieve. And I think this is going to be actually where we see some of the greatest innovation occur. In a down economy, when we have less complacency, we have to get a little bit more creative with how we grow, how we capitalize. It's going to be, I think, where we see some of the greatest ideas emerge and scale. So I have kind of a bit of an opportunity, I guess, an optimistic view of where we will be. I'm hoping that this recession is short and not as painful as previous ones we've had.
Yeah, exactly. There's still a lot of confidence. I think there was this the CEO report, and I think it was like 63% of CEOs of all sizes of companies are still on a hiring spree. So, and I think even though it may have come down, let's just say by like 8 percentage points over the quarter before, like the mood is still generally quite confident. For not only for founders, otherwise they wouldn't be doing raises. Like they wouldn't be doing what they're doing.
It's really true.
It's really true. And yeah, I mean, as I said, like outside or falling short of like literally the wheels coming off and massively, like literally like there's an implosion, which may happen. Like I think the last prediction was like 2030, but who knows? But I guess the key thing here for me, I just maybe want to spend one more minute on, a couple more minutes on, is about this idea of growth and versus scale, because I think there's good growth and then there's bad growth. And from my personal experience, like ambition is a double-edged sword. Like I saw my ass when we were doubling revenues every year and just ramped up, and then COVID happened, and then it was like, oh shit, and then it was like, oh, if only we were a little bit more cautious around what we thought appropriate growth was, so. It's like also it's kind of like, if you're adding 15 people a month to your OpEx, like that starts to impact things like DEI. It starts to impact things like culture and onboarding and training. And so you may not have the right people in the right bus seats. You may not have the right structures to enable this growth that you're on. And then you've got an investor on the other side, or maybe even a board, depending on the nature of that particular engagement. Like they're going, you must grow at all costs.
Right.
I want that 10x, right? So you're kind of sitting in this difficult position where you need to get a return on your investor, for your investors, but there's a complete clusterfuck in the operations of this business because you haven't set it up right, and or
100%.
You don't have the skills, dude. Like,
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Isn't it like some crazy number, like 50% of venture capital backed startups in the US, the CEOs get replaced after a period of 3 years? Like, so
yes, I believe it. That sounds right. And I think you're absolutely right, Matt. This growth at all costs. I mean, if we think about the economics of these funds, they are betting on essentially winners and losers, 10x or bust. And the truth is, the vast majority of small businesses around the world, which we know make up basically the majority of our global economy, by the way, right, don't operate in this hyper growth at all costs mode. They operate usually sustainable businesses that have a positive EBITDA, right? And they don't have to grow like that. So I think, while I'm a huge fan of, scale and growth, I think a lot of organizations, a lot of, founders feel this pressure, this inherent pressure and urgency to grow at all costs. And oftentimes it means they're making really detrimental decisions to their sustainability, to their culture, and to your point, to their diversity. And that's really why I think it's important that we find values aligned investors who can help us sustainably grow. And hopefully I hope that we're reaching a point in the next decade where a lot of the KPIs that we've traditionally had for venture-backed companies start to become a little bit more normalized. And I think we're already starting to see this, where some venture capital groups are saying, look, while I care about growth, I also care about your well-being, right? Your mental health and well-being as a founder. Because I know if you burn out 2 years in, we're not going to be seeing our investment back, right? So I think we're becoming more conscious, I would like to think, as a venture community, but we have a long way to go still. And founders still have a lot of power in setting that tone, you know?
Mm-hmm. I love that idea of values aligned investment. That should be your next startup. So take what you've
Oh my
learned and then
goodness.
like spin that off. Like who's your,
Yes.
whose money should you take, dude?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and as you know, that requires the founder to do soul searching around what do I actually care about, you know?
Mm.
And I think we, you know, again, we put these rounds on such a pedestal, you know, like if I just achieve my Series A, everything will be fine. Well, we also know, and you know from experience, that like you hit that milestone, and it's just the next milestone that's your next thought, you know. So I think we also have to get really clear on like what does success look like for me, you know. What do I want to be feeling and thinking, and how do I want, you know, my culture to really look, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Arthur, just want to have a quick bit of fun with you. So I'm going to give you the keys to the Map Round Show time machine. And I'd love for you to go back to like day one. You know, you told Google goodbye, and you're like, "Cool, I'm going to go solve this problem." What advice would you give yourself on day one? Right, think about all the lessons you've learned, the successes, the failures, and stuff like that. What advice would you give yourself on day one about building Mathison?
Yeah. Well, I would say, sorry about the background noise.
No, it's all good.
I would, yeah, sorry about that. Delivery here. I would say, first of all, Matt, the advice I would give myself is to be more patient. I think based on what we were just talking about, my own sense of urgency and impatient kind of mindset has largely been driven by these external pressures that I felt. But most of the time as entrepreneurs, it's self-induced, right? We sort of get in our mind that, you know, an investor wants to see greater traction, or that, you know, boy, a future fundraise depends on me hitting these metrics, and that pressure becomes really self-induced. So I would say, give myself more grace, be more patient, be willing to not overwork and burn myself out, and just to remind myself of that all along the way, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like you literally like my kindred spirit, because I'm the same. Like everything must happen now. Like, you know, I don't want to wait for shit. Like, because for me, like my sense of self-worth is like directly you know, associated to my sense of achievement. So if I'm not achieving something, I don't give a shit what it is. Like parenting, exercise, business, podcasting, like, you know, like I have to be hitting those things, because otherwise it's like, you know. And so yeah, and I found that, you know, patience is something that's also a skill to develop. Like if you're not built with, you know, like I think it was my mom, she said to me, Matthew, she was like, Matthew, you're so impatient, but you know that like with infinite patience comes immediate results.
Yes. I love that. Wow, what a wise piece of advice to give someone, you know. And you're right, we're not conditioned to be patient and by default. And in the external pressures we're seeing, whether it's the economy, the pandemic, changing nature of work, everything is weighing on us to be even less patient, right? So it's fighting a lot of natural urges, especially just by default as an entrepreneur, to be patient. I think it takes a lot of courage, frankly.
Yeah, it takes 15 years to be an overnight success.
Yes, that's right. That's a good point. Yeah, it's true.
Well, it's true, dude. Like, but this is the thing. Like, if you read the front cover of Entrepreneur Mag or TechCrunch, and it's like, this company got acquired for this amount, and you're like, oh shit, like, you know, that only took them 18 months, surely. Like, no, it like took 10 years, dude. Yes,
right.
So Arthur, there's a lot. I feel like we only scratching the surface here, but I have to wrap this up. Unfortunately, I've got another Built to New York series coming up. I'd love to ask you this final question, which is this. Like, why do you do what you do? Like, what gets you out of bed in the morning?
Yeah, no, I love that question, Matt. The biggest thing for me is that I think there are so many great individuals in the workforce who don't have a voice, who don't feel inspired by the work that they do every day, and also don't see themselves represented at the top of their organizations. And I think that with technology and with new models, we can change that. I think we can see much greater equity in the workforce, and I hope that means greater progress for society. So that's really, I think, at the end of the day, what you know, sort of gets me up every day.
Mm-hmm. And I can definitely tell you're passionate about that too. And I think, passionate founders are the ones that tend to really change the world. So I'm definitely going to get you back. I'm sure we'll do something at some point.
Yes, I love that, Matt. I love our conversations.
Yeah, it's great, man. But thank you for being here, man. I really appreciate your time and wishing you and the team there. You've achieved incredible success despite a pandemic and despite a lot of things that were stacked against you. And that's obviously an indicator for future success. So congratulations and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for your series too. This is awesome.
Anytime, dude. Thanks, guys. Ciao, ciao.
All right. Take care.
Ciao. Bye.